So the subject of my paper is Holy Fountainheads, Octagonal 13th century chapter houses and sacristies. And this paper focuses on the Sacristy of Wells Cathedral. Unsurprisingly, the role of the baptismal font has, since early Christian time, taken precedence in the perception of Christians in terms of the provision of holy water. But today, I want to ignore the baptistry and baptismal font and to look at other parts of the church that were sources of divine water, namely the sacristy and the chapter house. Let us first consider the sacristy. Before presenting my ideas, I need to detail the names of the chambers I'm going to discuss. During the Middle Ages, the ecclesiastical treasure house was referred to as a thesaurarium, a treasury, in the sense of a building containing treasure, as was the case at the Cathedral of Wells, whose statutes specified that Corpus Christi processions should leave the cathedral by the west door and make, quote, the circuit of treasury, cloister, and cemetery, circuens thesaurarium claustrum et cimiterium. Within the thesaurarium, a number of rooms might be grouped together, but the most important, and indeed the only essential room, is a sacristy, described by the 13th century theologian Durandus as the sacristy or place where holy vessels are deposited or where the priest puts on his robes. Within this chamber, water was in constant flow. It was here that the ritual preparations for Mass took place, and here that priests' hands were washed with holy water. Here also that the preparations were made for the ritual asperges, the sprinkling with holy water. Here that the blessing of the water used for cleansing all the altars of the church took place, and the procession for that ritual began. Records show that the sacristy was also the location of ceremonial foot washing of popes or bishops. The Ordines Romani of the 13th and 14th centuries record that on Ash Wednesday, the Pope made the procession to Santa Sabina with bare feet, and that they were ceremoniously washed in warm water, infused with sweet-smelling herbs in the sacristy before he said Mass. The 13th century statutes of Lincoln Cathedral instruct that when the Bishop of Lincoln walked barefoot from St. Catherine's Priory to his cathedral, his feet were washed in the sacristy. At Canterbury Cathedral, during the induction of Archbishop John Kemp in 1452, the Archbishop moved from the high altar to the sacristy for the ceremonial washing of feet before Mass. Most important of all, the sacristy was devoted to the cleansing of the Eucharistic vessels after they'd been emptied of their contents and returned to the sacristy after Mass. For this reason, a sink was needed together with a source of water. Lanfranc of Canterbury makes this clear in his constitutions. He directed that the washing of corporals must take place intestina in sacrarium. So sacristies were provided with sources of water, often by means of pipes, but sometimes directly in the form of a well within that chamber. Sometimes these holy wells were given visual identification in the form of polygonal towers, for instance, on the exterior of the sacristies of Ripon Minster and Lichfield Cathedral. Now to move on to chapter houses. The chapter house was primarily a place of prayer. In no way was this more important than in the mandatum ceremony, in which the feet of the community were washed, not by the lesser members, but by its head, the abbot, or the dean, in emulation of Christ washing the feet of the disciples before the Last Supper. Again, Lanfranc of Canterbury directed that this should take place in the chapter house. Quote, "The brethren shall enter the chapter house, and the abbot and prior shall gird themselves with linen cloths, and both on their knees shall wash the feet of the brethren, dry, and kiss them." The 13th century customary of Abbot Ware of Westminster Abbey gives instructions for the ceremony of mandatum. Quote, "At the ceremony of mandatum, within the chapter house, the prior removes his shoes and together with him, the monk who's the senior on the other side. And immediately after these two, the senior monks from each side take off their shoes in order, and gradually descending through the ranks, the same is done. The customary goes on to give instructions about the process of changing the water as the foot washers move down the ranks of monks. At Salisbury also, later medieval documents record that on Maundy Thursday, the canons went to the chapter house for the Mandatum. However, such a ceremony was not simply an annual reenactment of the Last Supper, performed on the day before Good Friday. It actually occurred weekly in many communities. In order for its performance, two things were necessary: a source of water and a bench to accommodate those whose feet were washed. Chapter houses, like sacristies, therefore, were areas devoted to ritual cleansing. Truly, they were fountainheads of holy water. I now move on to the subject of my paper, the Undercroft of the chapter house of Wells Cathedral, which you've been looking at for the last 10 minutes. Now to see the exterior. Right from the start, I want to make clear that the building known as the chapter house consists of two parts, dating from two distinct historical periods. The distinguishing feature of the building is that it is a large, diameter 54 feet 4 inches, octagon. Seen from the exterior, the difference between its two parts is visually striking. The lower story occupies no more than a fifth of the total elevation. Its fenestration is plain. Its sides are pierced by pairs of narrow, pointed, deeply splayed windows, set in thick walls and barred. Above this austerity, the upper floor is a complete contrast, its sides broken by huge windows filled with tracery. Documentary and material evidence confirm the difference in dates between the two stories. A Chapter Act of 1286 records the intention, quote, to complete the new structure begun long since, and, quote, to repair and support the ancient building. Scholars agree that the style of the upper floor of the octagon, that is the chapter house, accords with the date of the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. What of the lower story? On the exterior, as you can see, it has the same distinctive three-beaked buttresses as those attached to the Bishop's Palace, a chapel of 1210. Its windows share the same stark, unmolded character of the windows of the cathedral, completed before 1239. The molded capitals of the piers in the lower chamber match those of the first stage of the cathedral's central tower, again of 1239, particularly those with the heavily undercut bells. This carries the startling realization that for some 40 years or more, it was the dominant building on this footfall. That a second floor was planned from the beginning is indicated, and I've arrowed it, by the existence of a newel stair, which does not actually access the present upper story chapter house at all. The conclusion to be drawn is that the Undercroft was not planned to be simply a subservient support, but rather to be an important piece of architecture in its own right, and that perhaps the original design was to have an upper floor above it more modest than the present one. With such a realization in mind, we move on to an examination of the Undercroft. First, its location. It's important to acknowledge that when it was created, Wells Cathedral had no cloister opening off. That was provided in the later 13th century. So the traditional location for a chapter house, opening off the East Cloister Walk, was not on offer. But as we will see, its position conforms precisely to that of an ecclesiastical sacristy and treasure room, opening as it does off the choir aisle within easy reach of the cathedral's high altar. The chamber is large, with a diameter of 53 feet 6 inches. At its centre is a massive octagonal central pier with attached shafts. The striking feature of the chamber is, as you can see on plan, that a circle of 8 sturdy columns surrounds this central pier, and thus 2 concentric aisles are created rather than a single space. Each of these concentric circles of space is covered by pointed rib vaults. The chamber presents a paradox. It is deeply impressive in terms of its size and architecture, and yet starkly plain in its ornamentation. But no trace of any former wall painting remains. With such a feature still present, it would have appeared much richer. There's no mystery about the function of this large octagonal building. As shown earlier, the 13th century statutes of the cathedral specified that Corpus Christi procession should leave the cathedral by the west door and make the circuit of treasury, cloister, and cemetery. Following this route, they would have passed in between the west door and the cloister, the octagonal building, thus identifying it beyond question as the Thessalarium. Its huge space evidently acted as a depository for the cathedral's sacred treasure, its sacra vasa, reliquaries, liturgical books, and vestments. However, 2 features suggest that, at least originally, its function may have gone beyond that. First, its interior was provided with a stone bench running round the perimeter wall. Secondly, it contains an unusually large late medieval lavatorium, originally one of a pair. That this huge chamber should be provided with 2 lavatoria links with the fact that water is present immediately below it, and that the city of Wells derives its name from the springs that erupt next to the cathedral. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that when the building was first conceived, and indeed first used, it fulfilled the combined role of Thessalarium and chapter house. Now, a link must be made with earlier buildings of the same octagonal form, which combine the same dual functions of chapter house and sacristy. By the time of the creation of the Wells Undercroft, 2 polygonal chapter houses had been built in Britain, both at Cistercian foundations, Margan of 1200 and Abbey Dore of about 1200. Although I would not deny the possibility that they were inspirational for the Wells Undercroft, they are significantly different. They're not 8-sided, but 12-sided. Unlike the Wells Undercroft, they have large windows. Finally, they do not open off the church's choir aisle, but rather are located traditionally to the east of the cloister east walk. 3 early 13th century octagonal buildings situated at Salisbury Cathedral, the Collegiate Church of Saint-Omer, France, and Beverley Minster have common characteristics that mark them out as possible models for the Wells Undercroft. All are, or were, the structure at Beverley is known only by excavation, octagons. All were 2-storied, all had austere exteriors, but sumptuously embellished interiors. All were located off the choir aisle of their churches. The octagon Salisbury has an elegant Purbeck marble central pier in its ground floor chamber, and its upper floor has a wooden central pier and vaulting. The lower chamber at Saint-Omer has no central pier, but instead an ambitious oversailing vault with a beautiful keystone. The role of all three octagons can, with confidence, be established by documentary and material evidence as sacristies and treasure rooms. However, all three undoubtedly combined this role with that of chapter house. In the case of Salisbury, the later 13th century octagonal chapter house was not in existence until 30 years after the creation of the smaller octagonal building, which you see on the right, which itself was used as a chapter house during the Middle Ages for meetings involving a smaller number of canons. The octagons at both Saint-Omer and Beverley were named as chapter houses later in their history. Within this 20-minute paper, an exploration of the long history of water providers, be they wellheads or fountainheads, together with their design, is impossible. If direct precedents for polygonal water towers are sought, monastic 12th and 13th century lavabos and water towers would seem obvious models. Excellent 12th century examples are at the Monastery of St. Babel, Ghent, and of course, as you all know well, the Monastery of Christ Church, Canterbury. Krautheimer argued that medieval Christians were constantly aware of prototypes for the architecture that they themselves created. For medieval Christians, the greatest prototype of a building associated with holy water was the Jerusalem temple. Reminders of the connection between Solomon's temple and holy water occurred within the readings and antiphons that were performed within the sacristy itself. For instance, before Mass, the ritual cleansing of the officiants with holy water at Eastertide began with the words, "I saw water flowing from the right side of the temple. Alleluia." By the 13th century, the huge 7th century Islamic octagonal Kabat al-Saqqara Mosque, known universally as the Dome of the Rock on Temple Mount, Jerusalem, was renowned in the West. Under Latin rule between 1099 and 1185, it had been identified by Christians as the Old Testament temple, Holy of Holies, God's house, the Templum Domini. Albert of Aix, about 1100 account, based on what he learnt from returning travelers, emphasized the size of the building, quote, almost a quarter of an acre wide, 2 cubits high, and, quote, walls in a circle miraculously constructed. Describing the building in about 1173, the German traveler Theodoric wrote, quote, the temple itself is evidently an octagonal shape in its lower part. A drawing of the building was included in a mid-13th century copy of the treatise on the temple by Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln. The temple was famous for its provision of water. Today, the area is covered with wellheads. In the 4th century, the Bordeaux pilgrim noted that the area of the platform on Temple Mount, quote, below ground, there are some great water cisterns and pools built with enormous labor. By the Crusader period, these cisterns were still in existence. An eyewitness, Theodoric the monk, recorded again 1172 that, quote, round about the temple itself are great pools of water under the pavement. It would be unsurprising, therefore, if in the Latin West, buildings that were sources of holy water should intentionally recall the Templum Domini, and if octagonal sacristies come chapter houses, including those at Salisbury, Saint-Omer, and Beverley, should have been built with the deliberate intention of prompting memories of that prototype in Jerusalem. But these small buildings are but distant memories of the Jerusalem temple. However, We are on different grounds when it comes to comparing the Templum Domini in Jerusalem with the Wells Undercroft. Although it outscales the Wells Undercroft, the key similarity between the buildings lies in the interior space. In both cases, this consists not of one concentric ring, but of two, thus creating two concentric ambulatories. Granted, the central space of the Templum Domini rises above its surrounding ambulatory and is covered by a dome. Nevertheless, the underlying principles of the two buildings are the same. Tellingly, the buildings look very similar when drawn as a ground plan, suggesting that the design of the Jerusalem building could be brought from Jerusalem to Wells by a returning traveller. In fact, in 1978, John Harvey himself suggested that the polygonal dome of the rock could be a prototype for English chapter houses. He was in a good position to make this judgment because he personally knew the Jerusalem building well, having, as a young man, assisted his father in the long and detailed task of surveying it. He identified English masons who in the early 1200s travelled to Jerusalem and back, though sadly, they worked in East Anglia in one case and Chichester in another, but not in Wells. The evidence surveyed in this paper leads me to the conclusion that British 13th century polygonal chapter houses and treasure houses were polygonal to signify their function as dispensers of holy water. Whether or not you find my argument convincing, I hope I have persuaded you on your next visit to Wells Cathedral, when you visit the chapter house, to make sure that you also go into the magnificent chamber beneath it. Thank you very much.